Bone Spear is absolutely crushing everything in Season 2. It has the tankiness to farm 100s, it has the damage to speed farm every boss, one-shot everything 100s, and it has the speed to be the fastest leveling build in the game. In fact, the team that was the first team to level 100 was 4 Bone Spear Necros. There are 2 different engines that this build uses for essence generation. One is for single target and the other is for AoE. Let's first talk about the one we use in AoE because it's really interesting. The way that it works is we use Lidless Wall, which will cause us to spawn Bone Storms whenever we have an active Bone Storm. Which, you haven't seen it before, it's just going to cover the map of Bone Storms. You get loads of them. And then we're going to run the aspect of Osseous Gale, which will cause our Bone Storms to consume nearby corpses. And this includes the Bone Storms spawned by Lidless Wall. So we are constantly consuming corpses of everything that we spawn. Then this is paired with Grim Harvest, which gives us 6 essence every time we consume a corpse, and you can see how the essence generation of this build gets out of control. We have completely infinite essence in AoE. In single target, we're going to use Bone Prison, which will give us 30 essence on cast, in combination with Tybalt's Will, which is going to give us 50 essence every time we dash. These 2 sources combined allow us to have infinite essence in single target. The interaction between Lidless Wall and Osseous Gale gets even more interesting because the corpses consumed from the Bone Storms created by Lidless Wall actually increase the duration of your main Bone Storm, meaning getting 100% uptime on Bone Storm in AoE is completely trivial. It never falls off. So essence generation is a big part of this build. It's very important that we always have near cap essence because of so many of our damage multipliers are coming from the amount of essence we have. But with all that in mind, let's get into the skill tree and start breaking down how this build works. So for our basic skill, we're actually going to be running Hemorrhage because it's the largest essence generation on a range skill that we can get. And then we're going to be constantly picking up Blood Orbs, meaning that we're going to get even more essence on use. So the idea here is that we can just cast Hemorrhage like once or twice and cap up on essence again. We're going to be putting 5 points into Bone Spear, getting Paranormal Bone Spear for the increased crit chance and damage, all that stuff. We're going to be running Hewed Flesh. The corpse generation from this is really important for bossing and in AoE. Hewed Flesh is just amazing in this build, specifically because it just gives us targets for corpse tendrils. We're going to be putting 3 points into Grim Harvest. This is what we were talking about before, about the essence generation from Osseous Gale plus Lidless Wall. And we're going to be putting 3 points into Fueled by Death, and this is buff, it will always be up. We're going to be running Bone Prison. So Bone Prison is actually decent in this build because all minions now have the old Death's Defense passive, and that includes the Bone Prison walls. So when you drop them, it actually takes them a little bit to get killed. So it's actually a decent form of crowd control. But the biggest reason why we're running them is because in single target against a boss, it's going to be 30 essence on one cast. So Bone Prison is going to be able to refill our essence extremely quickly. Moving on, we're going to be running 3 points of Death's Embrace. This is going to give us the damage reduction, and also, because there's so many mobs with suppression, where you have to run into melee range to fight them, it's also a nice damage buff. So it's damage reduction in a lot of cases, also a damage buff when you need it. Death's Reach, we're always going to be using this on bosses, and against a lot of packs, it's just going to be 12% damage. It's kind of weird to run both, I know, but I think you want to in this build. We're also going to be running Abhorrent Decrepify for cooldown reduction, mostly just for uptime on corpse tendrils, and then for the 20, well, I have a Harlequin on, so for me it's 24% damage reduction. The Harlequin, by the way, is not needed, but I am wearing it, which is why you can see all these skills have +4. Harlequin is definitely amazing in this build, but it is not at all needed. It just takes the build over the edge. We're also going to be running Amplify Damage for 12% against cursed enemies. We're going to be running Corpse Tendrils, and we're going to be running Blinded Corpse Tendrils. You could run Plagued Corpse Tendrils. The thing is that we have a lot of sources of vulnerable in this build through our dash, through Bone Spear itself. We have a lot of ways to apply vulnerable, and the health orbs are kind of nice. You could, though, make the argument for Plagued Corpse Tendrils. I think both are fine, but definitely we're running Corpse Tendrils. We're going to be putting 2 points in Necrotic Carapace just for some Fortified generation from Hewed Flesh. And then we're going to be running 3 points of Serration for the increased crit chance, 3 points of Compound Fracture for the increased damage, and 3 points of Evulsion for even more damage. And then we're going to be running, Bone Storm. This is another build where we're running the full Bone Storm setup. I saw there's a lot of comments in the last video. People don't like it, but it's just so good for survivability, right? We get tons of tankiness, 15%, plus all of the shield generation and the corpse consumption, and you have Lidless Wall, putting Bone Storms everywhere, and enemies are getting hit like crazy. The essence, everything is just wild. You kind of have to have it. And then we're also getting 20% crit, which is also great. This is going to allow us to hit crit cap really easily with 100%. 3 points into Standalone for the damage reduction, 3 points into Momentum Mori for the sacrifice bonuses. We're also going to be running Ossified Essence, of course, for our key passive. So for our gear, like I said, we're going to start with the helmet. Like I said, Harlequin is not needed, but this is absolute turbo gigabyss. Nothing is even close to Harlequin. But you could run Godslayer helmet is a decent option, and then also Deathless Visage is a decent option. I think Harlequin, though, is like a mile ahead of Deathless Visage, but obviously most people are going to have one, so Deathless Visage is a decent alternative, or Godslayer Crown. We're definitely going to be running the aspect of Shielding Storm, and our stat priority on our chest, we're going to want total armor, max life, damage reduction while fortified. Then, so gloves, I actually don't have a decent pair of gloves, but we're going to be running Osseous Gale on them in this case. But you want int, lucky hit chance, attack speed, and ranks of Bone Spear. For pants, so when you're bossing, so this is going to get into like the first weird thing. So when you're bossing, we're going to run Tybalt's Will with a two-handed weapon. But whenever we're farming the world or Nightmare 100, we're going to do this little swap. And the swap is really easy to do. It's only the gear that we have to change, but it's going to make a dramatic difference. And basically, we're going to be swapping from Disobedience into Tybalt's Will, because we don't have the essence generation in single target to not run Tybalt's. And Tybalt's is also going to be a 40% damage multiplier. Bosses do like no damage in this game, and so the extra survivability is not needed at all. So we're instead just going to run Tybalt's for the damage and essence generation against bosses. And then the other thing that we're swapping against bosses, again, because the damage reduction doesn't really matter that much, we can just take off Lidless Wall, and at that point we just want to switch to a two-handed weapon, right? Because it's just generally going to be a lot more damage. And the Bone Spear aspect, Splintering aspect, is amazing for that. So this is going to be like one of the awkward things about the build, but I think this is needed. You need the survivability to do 100s. And you can see in the clips, I'm still one-shotting everything, so who cares? On our boots, we're going to want movement speed, damage reduction while injured, essence cost reduction, and ranks of corpse tendrils. And then we're going to be running the Wind Striker aspect, which will give us 16% movement speed. There's a vampiric power that a lot of you guys will know that gives you attack speed based on your movement speed. And so this is also a damage aspect, which is pretty nice. Like I said before, we're going to be running Splintering aspect on our weapon, Lidless Wall. And then on our necklace, I like movement speed on the necklace because you're speed farming 100s anyway, so who cares? So you want movement speed, and then a ranks of a damage passive, cooldown reduction, and then any damage reduction that's useful for you is fine. And then you're going to be running the aspect of Grasping Vines for the damage multiplier. For the rings, we just want crit chance, max essence, resource generation, max life, those kind of things. Crit damage is alright. Like, any damage modifier is okay, but none of them are that amazing. So I think lucky hit would probably be better. So the best stats would probably be crit chance, lucky hit, max essence, resource generation. But regardless, we're running the aspect of Serration, which is going to give us another 40% damage multiplier. And then we're going to be running the aspect of Torment. So Torment is going to give us a constant flow of essence, whereas the aspect of Exposed Flesh gives you RNG burst essence. And because of the amount of essence generation we have access to, the RNG burst essence isn't very useful in this build. It's a lot better to just get this constant flow of steady 170% resource generation than it is to randomly get 50. And so that's why we're going to be running the aspect of Torment. And that's going to do it for our gear. In terms of Book of the Dead, we're going to be running Skirmishers for our warriors for the increased crit chance. We're going to be running Cold for our mages for 15% damage to vulnerable. And for the Golem, of course, we're going to be running the 30% crit damage. Part of what makes Bone Spear do so much damage is the 15% to vulnerable and 30% crit damage. Those are massive multipliers, and then you consider the fact that everything's always vulnerable and also everything is permanently being crit. Every single attack that we do is going to crit. So moving on to the Paragon board, we've made a lot of changes to it this season because between Lidless Wall, the defense reworks, and everything else, we have a lot more survivability than we used to have. And because of that, we're actually able to play pretty much full offensive glyphs because you're able to be so tanky 100s that it doesn't really matter, and bosses don't do enough damage for them to really ever matter. So we're going to be running Sacrificial for 10% damage, and then we're going to be coming up here running Amplify for 10% damage, and obviously we're going to pick up Bone Graft. We're going to be grabbing Exploit for another 10% damage. We're going to get Flesh Eater, and remember, Flesh Eater is going to be up all the time because of the Osseous Gale Lidless Wall interaction. So this buff is going to be essentially permanent, 40% damage. We're going to be grabbing Corporeal for an additional 10%, and then Scent of Death. So Scent of Death is actually, it's almost always going to act as a damage buff because you're consuming all the corpses whenever you're in AoE because of Loveless Wall. And in single target, because you're so far away from the boss, you're almost never going to have corpses near you as well. So this is just going to generally just be a straight 15% damage multiplier. And then Essence is a fantastic glyph for this build because it's going to give us a 22% crit damage multiplier, which is all of our hits, right? Because we have a 100% crit chance. And it's going to give us 22% damage when they're not healthy. So this is extremely strong. Next, let's break down our vampiric powers. So the first one is going to be Anticipation. Now, Anticipation isn't terribly useful in this build, but it's more of a quality of life thing. If you're constantly running and gunning, you're never going to drop your Bone Storm. This is 20% won't mean much. But if you have to like AFK for a minute, if you alt tab, if you like run through an area, there's no mobs, if you have to backtrack, you can easily lose your Bone Storm. And this glyph just kind of makes it easier, right? It just makes the build feel a lot better to play. We really don't need a ton of damage because we're already like one-shotting everything in 100s, and boss fights are already crazy fast, and there's not really any good damage alternatives. So it's nice to just get some quality of life stuff. The next one, though, this is pure damage and clear speed. This is going to give us an attack speed buff based on our movement speed on a lucky hit. And this is partly why lucky hit on jewelry is really important, and especially on gloves, is to make sure that this is always up. Because this is going to be an absurd attack speed modifier, because your base movement speed is 100%, so this is at least a 40% modifier, plus any other movement speed that you have. This is a ridiculous attack modifier. Next is Prey on the Weak. Enemies are always vulnerable, so it's just a 16% damage buff. The other thing is that this is really useful because when your mobs are inside of a suppression, it can be hard to hit them with the bone shards to apply vulnerable. And Prey on the Weak allows us to dash through those mobs and apply vulnerable manually like that, meaning that it basically makes the build a lot more consistent while also giving us a huge damage multiplier. Sanguine Brace, the fortified generation is absolutely amazing for survivability. 8% crit chance is decent. Especially if you're below crit cap. If you're below crit cap, this is amazing. For me, I think I'm pretty far over it, to be honest. But this is still great to run for the fortified generation. And finally, the power that every single Necro build is going to be running for the entire season, Metamorphosis, is primarily being run because it gives us Unstoppable, but it also allows that interaction I described before where you can dash through enemies to apply Vulnerable. I want to close this video with a quick tip about Bone Spear. So if you don't know, most of the damage from the spear is actually coming from the shards, not from the spear itself. This is because of the splintering aspect, which is going to give them, on a one-handed weapon, a 60% damage buff, but on a two-handed weapon, it's going to give a 135% damage buff. That is a wild damage increase. So the shards are actually going to end up doing most of the damage. Now, the reason that's really important is because the shards are spawned either when the spear reaches its maximum length, or if the spear hits a wall. So it's very important that when you're clearing and when you're bossing, you're going to notice that whenever you see a Bone Spear player bossing, the boss is always super far away, and it's for this reason. And you're going to constantly see people pull mobs into walls and hit their spears on the walls to break them. And again, this is so that the splinters hit the mobs. This is that like reverse kind of shotgun effect where you're shotgunning them from the back. So it's very important to use this. And anyway, that's all I've got for you guys today. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.